Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I wanted to follow up on a previous podcast I did. That one was called Emotional Billionaires, and that talked a lot about sometimes you have somebody in your life who has really supported other people throughout their lifetime, provided a lot of emotional support or inspiration. And by the time they become late age, that it's hard to ever repay that if that's even a thing. So anyway, I encourage you to go back and listen to that episode, which is actually episode 67. So today we're going to talk about a little bit different take on emotional billionaires, and it's maybe from a different perspective. And that's the idea of time billionaires. So let me just step back a minute and talk about how I came to this topic for the podcast today. So I have a couple of close friends of mine who are in similar life situations, kind of very extensive and heavy career goals and opportunities. And they balance that with having multiple school-age children and then trying to somehow also protect their physical health and have some time for social development or social activities. And anyway, and there's many times where we have arrived at the same thought independent of each other. And one of those was a friend of mine saying, I just get this overwhelming sense that I wish I could just pause everything. Like in a video game, like you just hit pause and the whole world stops. And a lot of this was kind of oriented towards improved productivity. And I could sit down and finish this paper or this presentation or this project or whatever and get it sent off and then hit unpause and then all of life comes back, right? And so people start moving around the living room again, dinner gets on the table somehow, blah, blah, blah. And what was funny when she said that, there's been a couple times in my life where I've had that exact same instinct or thought, but just never shared it out loud. And I continue to have this experience at times where there's so much that you want to accomplish or get done or feel pressure to do, or things that you've sort of sold out yourself in the future, and now the future comes and you're over obligated or torn in a bunch of different directions. And instead of kind of making those hard decisions in the moment, I always have this weird thought that comes in my head, like, where is the pause button? Not stop. Like, I'm not morbid like that. Like, I just want the whole world to end. It's like there's so much going on and so much I feel like is flowing right past me, whether it's my kids growing up or my body getting older or opportunities that came across my email that I didn't act on. And those kind of accumulate in my mind. And I'm thinking, if I could just stop everything right now, pause the time clock, if you will, and go attend to maybe some tasks I don't even enjoy doing, but want to get them processed, then maybe I could be more present in the moment. And so that to me would be like time infinity. So in some other world, I'm able to stop this linear progression of everything else, right? And attend to whatever it is I feel like needs some dedicated time and then step back into my life. And so to me, that would be some superpower. So, they always ask, if you were a superhero, what superpower would you have? And to me, it's been very, very obvious that I would just love to have time stopped. And anyway, so that's not a thing as far as I know. If it is a thing, please let me know. If you know me well, I am a student of classical philosophy and literature and linguistics. I actually have a minor in classical studies for my undergraduate career. And I have really been enamored since I was a young kid about all things like Greek and Latin. At one point, I even was proficient at Latin and had a 5 on my Latin AP exam in high school, which is the biggest nerd award ever. But anyway, so going back to time. So the Greeks had 2 primary concepts of time. And I find this to be helpful kind of in this discussion about time. One is chronos, and that is sequential linear time, past, present, future, and you can quantify it. So it's so many seconds, so many minutes, so many hours, so many days. An example is like how much time has gone by. So I've been sitting at this chair for 30 minutes. And that obviously gives rise to the word chronological, right? So a chronological just means following time in a sequence. So A to B or time 1 to time 2. And if you think about chronos, if we look at it just from a kind of a cold, neutral perspective, and we want to quantify our life in terms of measured time, if we look at a life expectancy of 80 years, and you can do this very quickly, this math very quickly on a calculator, and you can measure it up to 80 years. Up to 100 years if you want, or 80 years, whatever. I'm just going to use 80 years. So if we look at a chronological lifespan, measured time of 80 years, that's about 2.5 billion seconds, about 42 million minutes, about 700,000 hours, and about 30,000 days. And so to me, a day goes by pretty quickly and I can just kind of blink and that day is gone. So for Chronos, that's sequential linear time. It's quantifiable. Currently, what I've calculated is I'm 42, and so I have about 38 years left. And that equivalent of about 13,800 days left. And now, if I think about it in terms of money, like if I had $13,000 and, if that is what I thought I had left for the rest of my life, then I'd be pretty discerning about things that even cost $1 or half a dollar, right? Because that's all you have for the rest of your life. And when we think about it in terms of our lifespan, we have this almost cognitive bias that we're going to live a very long time. And when information is presented to us that is life-threatening or life-shortening, right, there's this huge emotional reaction for most people because we have sort of this survival kind of bias, like I talked about, of just like, this is almost infinite. And what's interesting is I work with a lot of people that are at the very end of their life, and part of that does start to fade, especially if your body is not functioning well. And I've had a lot of people say, I think I've lived too long. Like all my friends are gone and I'm not feeling well and I can't really move around. And like, this is the other side of it, right? So I've had too many days, at least too many days with a body that's not working. But anyway, so let's just go back to Chronos, right? So Chronos is quantifiable. And if you know your average life expectancy based on all these different factors, you can just go do some simple math and say, this times this. And so people that are very young can be considered almost like time billionaires. So they've got about 2.5 billion seconds left in life to do what they need to do and explore and be curious and be creative and form connections. And then as we get towards the end of our lifespan, then we're time poor. And so interestingly enough, it kind of works that, you when you're younger, maybe if you're financially poor but time rich, and then as you go throughout life, maybe you're more financially secure but very time poor. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and it was interesting because I had this moment last week where I thought I really want to do some more research and maybe even do a podcast on time wealth, because there is such a big difference. And that is one of the things that the stressors in caring for aging parents is you have somebody who at that point in their life, usually in their 50s or 60s, can be relatively time poor if you look at their obligations, their career, other parts of their family they're taking care of. And then the aging parent being even more time poor, right? In chronological terms, like there might not be that much time left. And that pressure of, well, there isn't much time left to connect with this person or support this person. So time becomes a huge factor, not only just the expense of time, like spending time on something, but just the obvious idea of like, well, they have less time than I do. And so maybe I should help and participate in the time that they do have left. And so anyway, that's Chronos, that's measured time. But the other thing is Kairos. And Kairos is very different. And that's more about timing and the moment. And so it's like qualitative time. And I bet you can think of some times in your life where time stood still. And that's actually a phrase that we use, right? When the actual time that passed might have been 3 seconds. And this could be something horrifically bad that happened or amazingly good that happened, like the time that you got some really, really good news or some really, really bad news. And you can, I think most people relate to the idea that in that moment, although 3 to 5 seconds of chronological time passed, it felt from a Kairos standpoint, right, the qualitative time, like it was forever. A lot of patients I work with have been in really tragic accidents. And when you talk to their families, they say, that from the time I got the news until I got to the hospital, it was only 7 minutes, but it felt like 7 years. And that helps us really start to understand that there are two dimensions here. So there's that, like I said, kind of boring and dry quantitative time, like how much time has passed, and then qualitative time. And so, which is Kairos. And so you can think to yourself, one of the ways that I could, quote unquote, make time stand still is to focus on creating opportunities for myself or experiences for myself in which time does literally feel like it slows down. And that's really, when people talk about wellness or going on mindfulness vacations and things like that, and you find yourself in a secluded area without technology and without clocks, then that is one pragmatic way to at least alter the experience of time, although the chronological time may still be the same. An hour sitting on a beach at 72 degrees with the ocean waves and a bright sun, but you have some shade and a margarita, which is one of my favorite places in the world. That time is different. And one of the reasons I seek out that time so often is because it does feel like I have some control to kind of slow it down. And anyway, so I wanted to talk about time wealth. And then suddenly, I know sounds totally crazy, and I don't even believe in these kind of coincidences, but I turned on my podcast. Obviously, I'm a podcaster and avid podcast listener, and listened to a podcast, and it was literally about time wealth. And I couldn't believe I was already thinking about that minutes before I turned this on. And then the podcast came on, and it was a podcast on All the Hacks, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And the guest was Sahil Bloom, who just wrote a book called The 5 Types of Wealth. And the most important type of wealth that he talks about is time wealth. And he kind of goes through this example of Warren Buffett, who is a multi-billionaire. And, would you trade places with him to be a multi-billionaire knowing he's 95 years old? And this idea that, I'm not sure it's been posed as a question to him, but would he trade all of his money to have time back, to go back and be 25, 35, 45, even 65 years old? And I would bet the answer is yes. And so this idea that, financial wealth is sort of the end all be all, and often at the expense of time wealth, might need to be questioned for some people, including myself, right? And I'm always in the middle of this because now I work for myself, and I'm always could work more, could work less, could skip the podcast, could actually do the podcast, which is where I was about 20 minutes ago. I could finish my work or do a podcast. And anyway, so it kind of comes back to the rebalancing. I loved the way that he explained everything in terms of time wealth, which is not just like what age are you and how many hours do you have left in your life potentially, but also just, how can you find ways to improve your flexibility, reduce your time commitments for things that don't serve you. And then, there's a whole philosophy behind it. And just if you're curious, the other types of wealth he talks about are physical wealth, which is, obviously keeping your health about you, your strength, mobility, things that help you be able to live to 80 and be functional. Obviously financial health, but not making that the end all be all of all of your daily activities. Your social health, so, relationships that you have in your community with friends or coworkers or close friends and then acquaintances, and what you're doing to stay connected, and kind of highlighting social wealth as something that keeps you healthy long term. And then last but not least, mental wealth, which is kind of going back to like well-being, learning, growing, doing things that give you new experiences. And so we won't obviously get into all of those, but it did make me think about coming on the podcast today really to kind of refocus on how this would relate to somebody caring for an aging parent. And I mean that literally. So if it takes somebody 2.5 hours to drive over, get somebody ready to go to the doctor, go to the doctor's office, have that 30-second visit, and then get back in the car, and then come back home, then there's an exchange, right? So there's somebody who has a lot of time, potentially. I know this is not always guaranteed, but somebody younger who maybe has more time remaining in their life is taking 2.5 of those remaining hours and helping and assisting somebody who might have far less hours left. And when you listen to the previous interviews I've had with multiple guests, this comes up really frequently. And you'll hear things like, it's tough to make the time to do that, but I also know that I might not have a lot of time left with that person. And so that can be part of that exchange, if you will. And I'm not trying to make this all sort of a transactional relationship. I'm just looking at it from the point of view of chronos, of the measured time. A lot of what is intimidating or scary or anxiety provoking about caring for an aging parent is the high variability and the potential chronos or measured time that can be expended or expensed for that person. Meaning, like, it might be one doctor's visit every 2 months, but then it could build up into one hospitalization every 6 weeks. It could turn into 24-hour care. And you're looking at an obligation that is really hard to predict, just the nature of it. Like, there isn't any perfect way to say, when is this going to happen and how much time is it going to cost? And so a lot of what the angst I see in the people I talk to and the families that I work with, and even in myself, and I don't mean this specifically just about aging parents, but in how you care for other people, is the variability in what that time commitment might be. And I would offer that I don't want you to feel like there is an easy way to sit down and say, I'm going to dedicate 2.5 hours of my time per week or per month to assist this person. But there is some good to, when you're having a lot of anxiety or overwhelm, to really sit down and try to figure out what can you afford to do? Like, actually asking more specific questions. Is it 2.5 hours a week? Is it 2.5 hours a month? And if their care exceeds that, then you kind of go down this other pathway of, well, who else can assist? What other opportunities are there to have somebody else participating in a way that would help, or transportation, or trying to get this visit turned into a telehealth visit, or things like that. And again, I'm not proposing that this is an easy, switcheroo here that you say I'm going to spend less time, but chronological time, especially when you're somebody in a situation like I'm in, is so incredibly precious. And I don't mean precious as in, like, yes, of course I should spend more time with my kids and my family and outside and gardening and stuff. But, like, I just mean as far as scarce, because there's a lot of different demands and a lot of insatiable, is what I would describe it, demands for your time, energy, and talents. And that's the best way I can describe it. And I don't mean that from an arrogant way, like everybody wants some time with me, but the way I have constructed my life, it feels like I have brought projects and people and systems into my orbit that will always, at least at this point in my life, want and demand and be pouty if they don't get certain amounts of time for me. And it's been very challenging for me this last year or two, since I've left full-time employment, to claw all of that back and then start to reallocate it in a way that makes sense to me and to my family and to my goals. And I'm literally actively in the process for that. But what it's done for me is really make me appreciate that measured time and bring that up to the forefront of, there's only so much time in a day. Because no matter how powerful or rich you are, or how much meditation you do, there's still that hard limit. There are 24 hours in a day. And so if you're in the middle of caring for an aging parent, I just want to remind you, and as I remind myself all the time, there is 24 hours in a day. There's only so much you can do. And it is okay to try to make the tough decisions to make your value system and your life fit into that 24 hours, whatever that looks like. Okay, so enough about Chronos. Let's talk a little bit more about Kairos. So that's that qualitative time, the good timing, the good moments, right? The divine moments is another way that you can express it. And what I would say is, spending chronological time with somebody gives rise to higher chances that you get this Kairos type time. So maybe in the midst of that doctor's appointment that you're going to, and you're kind of saying, oh, okay, I'm like a time accountant and I've allocated 2.5 hours for this doctor's visit, and I'm going to accomplish a doctor's visit and then come back to my other life and, respond to all these emails and stuff, is the chronological time, if spent intentionally and sometimes just randomly, can easily turn into the Kairos time. So an example of that would be, on the way to the doctor, somebody suddenly shares a story that you've never heard, or a feeling that you've never seen them express, or gratitude, right? And we've talked a lot about how it can be really difficult to labor in a setting where there isn't any recognition or gratitude. That makes it more difficult sometimes to continue doing that. And that Kairos of, like, taking that extra moment to look at somebody, and I mean physically look at them. And I'm not trying to be creepy, but I do this all the time, especially with my kids, is like actually study their hands or their face or whatever is in front of me like as if it was a piece of artwork. And like my younger daughter has freckles on the bridge of her nose, like right underneath her eyes. And they change throughout the year. In the summer, they're darker and more plentiful. And in the winter, they kind of hide. But they're always still there right under the surface. And I always ask myself, like, are those going to be around when she's an adult? Are they going to disappear? And I kind of have this thing of like, that's what I study. And their eyes, like just their eyes that change over time. Or maybe it's the way that the shape of their hands. And like when my grandmother lived here, I always loved looking at her hands or photographing her hands because she has severely arthritic hands from decades and decades of hard, actual, like blue collar labor. And I've always thought, man, there's just not going to make hands like that anymore. My hands don't look like that and they won't look like that. And so that's where you can really kind of plug in the middle of all of this chaos of going to a busy doctor's appointment of like, what's actually in front of me? And I can say that from a physical standpoint, like what am I seeing? From like almost a sensory standpoint, like what does it feel like? What is that shirt that they're wearing? Are those hands that are soft or hard? From an olfactory standpoint, so smell, like what do things smell like? Is it a pleasant smell? Is it a concerning smell? Is it a smell that triggers me because that means that their brief hasn't been changed recently or something else has gone wrong? And approaching this sort of sensory experience of another human being in front of you is one way to kind of tap into that kairos of, really kind of going through sequentially. What do I see? What do I hear? What do I smell? Taste, we'll kind of put that on the table and say that's maybe for dinners or new food experiences, but at least for the other four senses, that is one way in the middle of all of this to really kind of connect with what's in front of you. And I don't mean this in like a fuzzy way, like suddenly if this is a difficult personality, you're suddenly going to, be really super excited to be around them. I just mean for your own experience. And when you ask yourself, what do I see? What do I hear? What do I smell? What do I feel touch-wise? Then suddenly you're engaging a totally different part of your brain that is getting back into sort of that timing moment presence versus that sort of pressure on that chronological time. And so I feel like for every, 5 to 7 seconds that I look at my daughter's freckles, every other day or so, right? In a lifetime, I mean, that's not that many seconds, but in the Kairos time, in the moments, like that's a forever thing for me. And it's a curiosity thing for me, like, and it just helps me, especially if I'm having a bad interaction with this daughter or she's having some behavior that's really irritating to me, really helps me kind of clue in at that exact moment. And what's so funny is when I practice this, like, and I start smiling or laughing while they're super angry, that it really kind of backfires because they get even more angry because they think I'm taking it not seriously. And this actually happens fairly frequently. It happened to me last week when my other daughter was having a behavior, and I was just kind of looking at her as if I was floating above the whole situation. And she was having all of these perfectionistic tendencies and being fairly neurotic and being really hard on herself. And I just saw myself at her age thinking and acting the exact same way. And I just kind of smirked and started giggling. And then she turned around and shot me this dart of an eye. And she just was like, how could you be laughing at me right now? And I thought, well, I couldn't really explain Kairos to her in this exact moment, but I was just like, this is such a fascinating evolution for me that you're like the mini me at age 13 and going through all of these neurotic episodes. And so anyway, when you are looking at the chronological time expended, I would also just think about an element. If this is a commitment that you're following through on because it's consistent with your value system, which we don't judge value systems on this podcast. If that's what you're going to do, I would encourage you to add another layer to it, which is that Kairos layer, right? Which is how you're going to take somebody who maybe doesn't have a lot of chronological time left, but really try to take information out of that, to take experiences out of that are outsized for the amount of time that's actually expended. And then, of course, if you really want to get down into this even deeper in other parts of your life, it goes back to mapping out how you spend your chronological time in a 24-hour period and trying to find small opportunities. Again, right? Going back to the freckles, that's like 5 to 7 seconds. And she's always, certain times of the day in front of me for different reasons, and finding almost like anchor points to how do I drop into this moment and not make it about whatever demand you're having in front of my face right now. And one of the best ways I've heard it described, and not necessarily for Kairos, but just in being present in a moment, is to feel like you're almost in a movie, like your whole life is a movie and you're sitting in the audience, which maybe in some philosophical ways you are, okay? So there's so many things you don't control. A lot of your life is just a movie happening in front of you, and that different people appear on the screen. And, my daughter appears at certain times, and my son appears at different times, and my husband appears at different times, and my patients appear at different times, and almost being like, oh, here's that one again. Here they've shown up, and like, what is this experience going to be? And that really, as we move through chronological time, and once my chronological time comes to an end, then the people that I've been appearing to, right? The real difference is I just don't appear to them anymore. And they get to keep all of the chronos and kairos that they had with me, or that I had with them. And then that's what you have. Like that's what other people would call memories, right? Or experiences together. And so getting really away from this hyper focus, at least in my lifetime, on building, academic or career or financial success has really resettled kind of in this point of my life of recalibrating things to understand that my time wealth is the superior of the 5 types of wealth we've talked about. And that, as described in the book by Sahil Bloom, is what unlocks everything else. And so if you have certain things that are fixed, like I have to work in this 40-hour-a-week job to feed my family, then you might get down literally into the nitty-gritty of, well, how much time am I spending on social media or, nonsense type things that don't feed me, that don't feed my family, that don't help me grow. And when you can reset things, the reason I like to do these resets is it makes you a lot more discerning and a lot more picky about your time when you're like, okay, I've got about, 13,000 days left. And it really does make it more difficult to just sort of, coast through one or throw one away when you can get really literal. And there's even, if you think about people that are in the Stoicism movement, which I always want to do a podcast on that. I will do that later. But Stoics that follow that philosophy have a tool, and it's a graph and it's a bubble chart that has 80 bubbles across the top row, and then 52 bubbles all the way down on the left, the left column. And so the idea is for every year you kind of fill in one of the bubbles. And so I think about that. I'm like, I don't have one of those. I probably could, find one on the internet. But then each week you're filling in a new bubble, and there's only so many bubbles that you have, right? And so it's 52 weeks times 80 years. And it might help you or scare you, depending on how you do this exercise, kind of understand where you are in life. And I love things that just take me out of the hustle, the bustle, the chaos, the seeking part of my brain, because that is like literally almost uncontrolled. Like, so I have to like close the door to that room in my brain and then go somewhere else and say, okay, like for real, what does this mean? And do I want to spend a week doing this? And then when you get really careful, you say, do I want to spend a day doing this? Whatever it is that is not, productive for you. And then you go down and you say, do I even want to spend an hour doing this? And I keep going in my life this past year or two. And I can like, do I even want to spend like a minute on this, like 5 seconds? And it's been great. And it feels very empowering to be able to discern at that level, especially if you're somebody who has a lot of work obligations or other obligations you can't control. I encourage you to go down to that last second of like, I'm just not going to spend even one more second on this ridiculous, task or this ridiculous waste of my time. And I've heard a lot of chatter about this when it comes to our phones, that somehow the phones have invaded our sense of time and our use of time, obviously, right? And I always get this pop up on my phone that's like, you've spent this many hours on the phone or this many hours on this app or whatever. And I used to hate those. And now I'm like, oh, good. I have the time police in my phone that are going to start reporting to me. So anyway, I know that was a meandering podcast like most of mine are, but just as a review, the idea is one of the main things we think about when helping and supporting aging parents is our time commitments, the time expenditures that it takes for that. And I wanted to have this time just to give you a couple of different ways to think about it, maybe different ways to assess it, and then also look at the positive possible outcomes of any time where you can take chronological time and just for a moment, just for a fleeting few seconds, turn that into kairos or divine moments. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you soon. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or two, sometimes 3, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.